What is happening in the gender revolution all around us, and what does the Babylon Bee have to say about it? Our guest today, Kyle Mann, is the editor-in-chief at the Babylon Bee, and he has a new book out called The Babylon Bee Guide to Gender, which we're going to discuss.
We're in kind of a weird and unique position at the Babylon Bee to be able to comment on this stuff using humor.
Boy, do I! Stop saying boy. It's not one of the approved genders to pick from.
I do think that gender is kind of the new battleground in a lot of ways.
Kyle, you and your team have written many books, such as The Babylon Bee Guide to Wokeness, which we had a conversation about here. Tell me what makes this book unique.
Yeah, the topic of gender and worldview when it comes to gender identity has been discussed a lot, and obviously there's a lot of interest in that from a Christian perspective. So we've seen a lot of books come out about that. But we're in kind of a weird and unique position at the Babylon Bee to be able to comment on this stuff using humor. And it's a challenge, especially you get to a sensitive topic like gender where, it's like, can we really laugh about this? There's so many horrible things going on, in that space. So it's been a fun and unique challenge. And that's been one of the challenges that we've had to overcome, as a satirical outlet is how do you comment on very serious topics using humor? And that's, you don't, if you look at, gender issues and all that, you don't see too many books out there that are tackling it from the perspective of humor, trying to get people to laugh and then maybe trying to get them to think a little bit. So that's kind of what makes this one unique, I think.
Well, we're going to get into some of that tension for sure. But I'm curious as a whole, you've written other books and your team has on wokeness. You've done some on like capitalism and socialism. How would you rank kind of the current gender revolution and in particular questions around gender ideology on your list of current cultural concerns?
I mean, I would put it way up there, does pineapple belong on pizza? Number one, maybe. The Star Wars sequels, Disney trilogy, number 2, and then right after that, gender. I think I do think that gender is kind of the new battleground in a lot of ways. And we'll take some criticism as Christians, and then specifically us as the Babylon Bee will take some criticism for, you make so many jokes about gender or pronouns or identity. Why are you guys so obsessed with it? And it's like, I mean, that was kind of the talking point about the church 20 years ago when it came to homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Why is everybody talking about this? Well, it's what the culture is pushing right now. So in some ways it's what we're reacting to and what we're commenting on. I think as a humor outlet, our goal is to make fun of whoever's being the most ridiculous. And at the moment, it does seem like the people that are pushing kind of that fringe gender theory seem to be the ones who are most worthy of ridicule at this current time.
So what's the goal of a book like this? Is it entertainment? Is it persuasion? Is it to rally conservatives? In some ways, when I say conservatives, you have people like Bill Maher and quite a few other people who wouldn't fit in that category. They're strange bedfellows, so to speak. But is it to rally one side against the other? Are there multiple goals? What's the point of this book?
Yeah, a lot of times when we put humor out into the world, there's not one specific mission or goal that it goes out to accomplish. Like you want to write something that's funny, and I think it should be funny in a vacuum. It should be funny regardless of what the reaction is to it. We just want to write a funny joke. But because of our worldview and because of the things that we believe, that's going to come out in the humor, and the effect of it is that some people's minds are going to be changed. For us, our audience that already agrees with us might be more galvanized, or might, you read a book like this where we're writing a lot of jokes about pronouns and gender identities, and it might be a little bit of an eye opener to some people because we're making up goofy jokes and goofy genders and stuff for the book, but it's also actually communicating this is the logical outworking of this worldview. So I hope it wakes some people up within our own camp. I hope it helps people to laugh at something that's serious, in a way, because I think that's one of the really difficult things is that we can get so depressed, and we can get so angsty over the news, and I don't know, it's really depressing to scroll, conservative Twitter or Christian Twitter sometimes, and people post look at this crazy TikTok video of this elementary school teacher, or that's woke and is indoctrinating our kids. Our Western civilization is over and all this stuff. And it's nice as a humor outlet to be able to like
Mm.
bring some levity to that, even though it is a very serious topic. So yeah, multiple goals, multiple things that we're hoping to accomplish. I don't know how many liberals are really going to even pick up this book, but
Mm.
maybe if you put it out on your coffee table and relatives come over for Thanksgiving, it'll spark some conversation.
Fair enough. I was curious about what the audience would be. Now, the opening chapter in the book is called The Wacky World of Gender. Describe what you and your team, there's a whole team that wrote this book. What, 5 or 6 of you? Is that right?
Yeah, we had a team of,
Okay.
graphic artists and authors working on it. Yeah.
So what is this wacky world of gender as you and your team at the Babylon Bee see it? What's going on out there?
Yeah, so the wacky world of gender chapter is kind of our introduction into like, if you haven't been paying attention to the news for the past few years, uh, here's where things are at. Because it does feel like if you didn't turn on the news for the last 5 years, you would just
Mm.
like be like, what is going on?
Mm.
Who's the spokesperson for Bud Light? There, there's like such a huge cultural shift in just the last few years, and it's all based on this very fringe, idea of identity politics and specifically gender identity politics. And so that's kind of where we lay that groundwork in a funny satirical way. The voice of the Babylon Bee in these guides is always like, we are saying how great this thing is that's actually terrible. So
Mm. So I was curious, I know there's different ways to try to be funny. Like sometimes just the truth is funny. Sometimes exaggeration is funny. When you guys are writing this, are you taking something and just saying, how do we draw this out to such absurd like possibilities that people begin to think maybe there's something rotten in the ideas themselves? What is the mindset behind coming up with a lot of the jokes and examples that you have?
yeah, I mean, different jokes kind of require different sort of tact or a different mindset. Sometimes you approach a joke like, I really have this point that I want to make. What's the most effective way to reach the
Mm.
audience with this point? I do tend to think while those are fun and funny and they can be really strong, those tend to be not my favorite jokes, because my favorite jokes are when I just think. Sometimes I write down the weirdest little things. I'm just like, what is, I'll write things down like Kool-Aid Man, and then it'll just be sitting there in my notebook or in my email, drafts or whatever, and I'm like, why did I write this down? You know, and I'm like, oh yeah, because I thought the Kool-Aid Man was funny, and maybe we could use him in an article, at some point. So it's like, what really makes me laugh? It's like three people stacked on top of each other inside a trench coat, or raccoons make me laugh. Um, you know, People stepping on, it's in the cartoons where they step on a rake and it slaps them in the
Mm.
face. That like you try to think of like what is a universally funny thing, that we've all found funny as humanity, and we've all arrived at this is the funniest thing, and how can we take those references and jokes and kind of work them into this shell where the topic we happen to be
Mm.
talking about is gender. So it kind of depends on the joke, but yeah, you do approach it in different ways, ultimately just trying to write the best joke possible.
So give us an example of one that people might find in the book. Now, I realize you told me beforehand that some of the interviews you've done, people literally have the book and you don't even have one yet. I got a
Yeah.
PDF, so I don't have a physical copy or I would hold it up. But just give us an example of one kind of example or story that you use that stands out to you.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the book is like these lists of things like genders or gender flags, and those are fun vehicles for jokes, because once you have that setup of like, oh, it would be fun to list a bunch of fictional gender flags,
Okay.
then it's easy to fill that out, or fun at least to fill that out, because you're just kind of, once you have kind of, I call it like a gag machine. You have this joke, like a gag machine or a joke machine, then you can just churn out 30 different punchlines for this joke. And that works really well in these graphical guides. A lot of the book, stemmed from us also wanting to do some very basic, like classic man versus woman humor, like husbands and wives, what makes the difference between those. So we have chapters early on that are like, what is a man and what is a woman? And we get to talk about like what men are good at, opening pickle jars, uh, fixing stuff, breaking stuff, like bring all groceries in one trip, and then we have the things the men are not good at, and we have the things women are good at. I always like that stuff because I feel like since the dawn of time, humanity has been making jokes about the differences between men and women.
I did enjoy that. There were some pretty funny ones in there. That was I think one of the best sections, personally. Now, on page 9, you say the heart of this book is to educate you on what exactly gender means. All right, educate me, Kyle. What is gender? Is it a synonym for sex? Educate me. Go.
Well, if you want me to explain it in terms of the voice of the book, then I'm very confused about what gender is, because it's
Okay.
everything you want it to be, and it's nothing, and it's fluid, and it's changing, and it's imaginary, but it's also the most important thing about you. And that's really what makes this gender identity thing so crazy, is that it's very much like it's how you feel, and you look at some of these gender descriptions where people are like, oh, I've come up with my own new gender. I'm a pocket watch gender, and you're like, well, what does that mean? And they explain it, and they go, well, it means that today I feel very punctual and proper and mechanical. And you're like, okay, so it's just like your mood,
Okay.
or personality. It's like a personality trait. It's almost like those like the Enneagram, or what was the other one, the Myers-Briggs test. Like,
Yeah.
people like having that box to fit themselves into and to describe them. When I was growing up, it was, are you a Sega Genesis kid or a Super Nintendo kid? That's where you found your identity. And I think that same impulse to identify with something has just latched onto this thing that just happens to also be incredibly destructive in a lot of cases.
So if you were going to step out of the book's voice and give a definition of gender, what would you say? Would you be comfortable with the way it's often used in terms of somebody's expression of their sexuality? Or would you say it's a synonym for sex? Or where would you go with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the entire that framework, we need to reject as Christians, that it's something separate. It's an expression of sex. I don't think that's the case, and I think that's a very recent phenomenon that was invented by these people that are purveying gender theory. That's a very recent distinction that we made. C.S. Lewis had a really interesting quote about gender that I think about a lot, where he says that, I think he said something along the lines of, gender is not the same thing as sex or something, but he said gender is more eternal than sex. Like, gender is God made. I'm probably going to lose a lot of people, but he said that God made them male and female, but before there was male and female, there was masculine and feminine. And he was expressing these kind of objective eternal truths through sex. So it's not that there's sex and then there's this lesser thing, gender. It's that God has divided a lot of creation into these two kind of frameworks of masculine and feminine. And he uses the example of like words in Latin, where they're not assigning genders to things. They're recognizing the spiritual reality that, a mountain is masculine or whatever, which I thought was like, that was a real noodler for me. And I'm not sure I 100% agree with him, but I get where he's coming from, that sex is this thing that God created the sexes, to express something that's deep and eternal, and it's integrated into each one of us in this really profound way. It's so essential to who we are that you can't separate that from gender. Now, that doesn't mean every guy has to eat meat and mow the lawn and shoot bears or something, but there's going to be a spectrum of kind of how masculine, how feminine, but ultimately it is tied to that eternal truth of gender, I think.
So you made a comment earlier about identity, but there's a chapter in the book on identity politics. So maybe explain what identity politics is and what is its connection with the issue of gender. And you can choose Kyle's voice or the voice of the book. This is a choose your own adventure interview.
I'm a Calvinist, so I don't do the choose your own adventure thing. But no, the identity politics we addressed a lot too in Babylon Bee Guide to Wokeness, and it's the broader term for this phenomenon and this movement, and then we brought it more to bear in this book on gender. But identity politics is the concept that you can find all these intersections of identity of who you are. It's kind of like that Myers-Briggs thing I was talking about. That if the more intersections of identity that you can identify, intersections of oppression. I'm a Muslim in a wheelchair with, whatever, like with a mental illness that I've diagnosed myself on TikTok or whatever. Like whatever it is, not that those people can't experience oppression or can't experience real challenges in life, but it's trying to put yourself in this, classify yourself into these different classes, and you want to be in the oppressed class. You want to be to show that your problems are not your fault. All your problems are external. It's the world that's holding you down. It's society that's holding you down, and you have grievances. And it's society's job to make those grievances right to you. And it's a very kind of entitled, the world's not fair, and a way to explain your the problems in your life coming from outside yourself, not within yourself. And that it's basically just that applied to gender, gender identity politics of the more like unique or oppressed genders that I can align myself with, then the less I have to bear responsibility for anything I might have contributed to the problems in my life.
I teach a class for undergrads at Biola, and we talk about kind of critical theory and identity politics. And I have a huge chart in which I've worked out what it means to be an oppressor. And I literally walk through them and I say, do you want to see what the face of oppression is? It's me. I literally dot every I and cross every T, Kyle. My sex, male. Religion, Christian. I'm able-bodied. I'm cisgender, just to use that term because that's the way the term is laid out. I am my age. Sometimes young and older people are also oppressed. I'm heterosexual.
Are you young or old? What category are you? Are you young or
old? So there's adultism. There's a sense where youth are being oppressed and the older are being oppressed. So if you're middle-aged, you're not being oppressed. That's how a lot of the language goes. So I'm right in the middle. Literally every single one. Now, I'm not rich, but I live in Southern Orange County, so I have to have a certain level of income. I live in a wealthier place, you might say. So I tell my students, I say, if I don't strike you as the face of oppression, then maybe something is wrong with the metric we're using to gauge this. Just maybe. And I let it sit. But it's helpful to think about the issue of gender in terms of a larger question of identity politics and critical theory, because I think it's a piece of that. All right. We maybe covered this one, so let me ask it this way and see if anything else jumps to mind. You have different chapters on men and women that you were discussing earlier. In regard to both men and women, what are some of the cultural ideas that you take issue with? And how do you do so? What are some of the ideas you push back on and challenge that are coming through as a part of this gender revolution that you just don't buy?
Well, yeah, with men and women, it's a lot of, like we were just talking about critical theory, and it's that men are oppressors and that masculinity is inherently toxic. That masculinity is a bad thing, a thing to be a thing to rid yourself of. That's kind of like, what was it, James Cameron, the guy that directed Titanic and all that, he said something about that, we got to get rid of toxic masculinity. I need to purge it from my body. Like it's this weird, and obviously are there traits of masculinity that could be overemphasized? Absolutely. But there's traits of femininity that could be overemphasized. That's one of C.S. Lewis's things about the Christian life is that there's no one trait, there's no one impulse that you should follow at all costs. He says even motherhood could be an idol, and even motherhood could keep you from the kingdom of heaven if it's an idol to you. So yeah, there are obviously things that could become toxic if we want to subscribe to, the language that they use for this stuff. But like being, I guess the serious message, if there is one for the man and woman chapters in our book, is like, it is good that you were born the way you were. You were not born in the wrong
Hmm.
body, and it's good for you to become the man that God made you to be, and it's good for you to become the woman that God made you to be. Um, you know, uh, that is one of the most depressing and discouraging things about gender theory. The message that it gives to our young people.
Hmm.
Like you remember how awkward it was being a kid in high school or a kid in middle school, and you're like, I don't know where I fit in, and now you have these people coming in and saying, well, the problem's not you, it's your body. You were born in the wrong body. Like how horribly destructive that is to tell people like your body is wrong, and it goes against their entire message of like body positivity, and
Hmm.
that was kind of the thing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was like you are the way you are, love yourself. And now it's like, well, love yourself, but also cut off parts of your body and get really expensive surgery. That's the only way you'll ever be happy. Like, what a terrible message that is for our kids, I think.
Hmm. What's your take, Kyle, on preferred pronouns? Because this is one where even Christians differ pretty firmly. It seems like there's kind of three different camps, but I'm curious
Hmm.
where you would land. And you hit on this a little bit in the book, but it's not really. It's the purpose is not to answer for Christians whether they should use preferred
Sure.
pronouns or not. But what's your take on that?
Um, it's a simple question, and it's also, but I understand that it's complex for people and their personal life and application.
Hmm.
So, like, I think from a principled stance, it's like, and again, you can look at it from a Christian perspective. You can also look at it the perspective of living in a free society, that we can't compel speech on people that don't agree with you. And like it is such a weird thing because it comes from this place of reality has to conform to me. It's not that I have to change myself to conform with reality. If I find something off or something askew, or that, like, why am I out of step with the world? And what trans ideology says is, well, it's the world that's wrong, not you. And I think that's such a profound shift, and it's something that's been coming for 50 years, 100 years in our education system, is just telling people that there is no objective standard that you have to conform to. Um, but with the pronoun question, it's like I don't I don't recognize that you can just say, well, my pronoun is this, and then you just declare it, and then everybody must call you that. At the same time, obviously, like, as Christians, and if you're evangelizing to someone, you're talking to someone, and you feel like, what, this is going to be a roadblock. I don't know. I mean, is it a sin to sit there and affirm that fake identity for them? I don't know. I mean, maybe as a stepping stone, as you're kind of working your way towards
Hmm.
talking to them about this stuff, does it just turn them off immediately? Like, I would probably not. Well, here's the other funny thing about this question is, like, how often do you even use somebody's pronoun in front of them, right?
It's true.
Because it's
It's true.
you. I'm talking to you. I'm not saying like him or she or he or whatever. But it is like I think each of us does need to kind of think about it in a particular situation. But my goal would be to get to a point where I could have enough respect for someone, and they could have enough respect for me, where we understand each other, and it's like, hey, I'm not going to recognize this fake identity in you. But it also doesn't mean we have to be like jerk based conservatives that are like,
Hmm.
you're a him, and shouting at people. so
Hmm.
so it's a little bit of a balance, but generally I don't think I would subscribe to the idea that we should affirm people's sin and maybe even mental challenges.
One of the challenges I've gone back and forth in my mind is it a question of wisdom or is it a question of morality in many circumstances? It sounds like you're saying there could be times where it's a question of morality, but a lot of it is a question of wisdom with somebody. Is that fair? Or would you say it can overlap and be some of both depending on the circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously God will have grace on us as Christians trying to
Hmm.
navigate this confusing time. And I don't think we're going to get to the gates of heaven and God's going to be like, you know, you he's going to pull the lever for the trap door because you use the made up pronoun at one point. But I do think, as Christians, our goal should be to ultimately to uphold truth, and it's not loving to these people to affirm their sin ultimately. But yeah, obviously there's a wisdom question. I think God will have some grace depending on how we handle these questions.
So you've got a chapter on the nuclear family, and we've seen this with the Black Lives Matters organization, not necessarily the phrase. Most recently said they're trying to destruct and dismantle the nuclear family. Why do you see gender revolution coming into such conflict with the nuclear family? What's the tension that's there, and why must it be overthrown, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main things that any revolution is going to try to attack first, because the nuclear family is how we pass on tradition. This is what Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. We as humans arrived at these ideas, and as Christians, we believe that a lot of these ideas are eternal ideas that God has also communicated to us through his word and through nature and creation. But mankind recognized these things, and Chesterton says that mankind voted on them by all the traditions through all the years that have been passed down and have landed at this point of it's good to be married, one man and one woman, and it's good to have children, and it's good to be in community with each other, and it's good to go to church, and these kind of basic things that we all believed as a society. Maybe not always as individuals, or maybe we didn't always live up to them, but as a society, we kind of just generally agreed on these things. And without the nuclear family, you don't have the mechanism to pass those things on. You have kids just being kids in broken homes that are just being educated by whatever's on TV or TikTok or public schools or whatever. And you have to break down the nuclear family, because we're the ones who are shielding our kids from that, and are passing on these democratic ideas that that humanity has arrived at.
Fair enough. So I thought one of the most interesting chapters again was on the kind of the church of gender. Now, at first I thought you were talking about gender ideology seeping into the church, and then I realized you're talking about kind of this gender movement as if it's a religious movement itself. So do you see it as a religious movement? And talk about the 10 Commandments, the heretics, about some of the things that overlap with a traditional religious movement.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and there's another sense in which just politics in general, or leftism in general, really any extremes on the political spectrum become so religious, and it's such an interesting thing to watch, that people are like, I've rejected God and religion, and now I've replaced it with basically the same thing. It's just different figures and different prophets and different priests and different mandates. And with the Church of Gender, there is a religious and even a cult-like element to gender. That it is that, like we were talking about breaking down the nuclear family. That's one of the hallmarks of a cult, is that you have to break them away from their family that would otherwise guard them against these ideas. And these people become your family, and you see this in messaging online about gender from people on the left. If your family doesn't affirm your identity, cut them out. I was just watching a TikTok that was posted on Twitter the other day about this, that if your family doesn't recognize your neo pronouns or whatever, well, you don't need your family. Leave them, come to us. We're your family now.
Wow.
That is such a cult-like mentality, So yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. Hopefully we didn't stray too much into the blasphemy sphere with this. That's always a danger when you're doing jokes like that. But we have the 10 Commandments of queer ideology. We have some verses that we made up, as one does. All kinds of fun stuff. We talk about who the prophets are, who your new pastor is now that you're inducted into the Church of Gender, and all of that.
I appreciated the verses that had all the 3 dots, just literally saying we're making this say whatever we want it to. That was pretty creative in that area. So that jumped out to me, because I look at all sorts of movements. There's kind of an environmental radical movement that becomes religious. All sorts of things. When you get rid of God, it was Chesterton who said, you replace it with something else that functions like a religion. And gender ideology certainly can be one of those things. And you see it on the left and you see it on the right in different ways. All right. Now, are you concerned with gender ideology seeping into the Christian church? Now, you don't talk about that in this book. This is not technically a religious book, but you're an outspoken Christian. Do you see signs that certain kinds of gender ideology is seeping into the church, or do you still think those are kind of the exceptions that are out there?
It depends. Obviously, like mainstream, mainline denominations that have already abandoned, the inerrancy of the Word of God and the primacy of the Word of God, and they don't submit to it in all things, and those movements are completely susceptible to this because why not?
Hmm.
You're just being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine that comes, and that includes the doctrine of the Church of Gender. I in more mainline's not the right word, but in more conservative, but not necessarily politically conservative, just your standard regular church you might see on the street corner that's not in one of these mainline denominations. I haven't really seen it seep in because I think I've seen a pushback, honestly, from a lot of people that maybe have more conservative or traditional tendencies. And hopefully that trend continues because I think it's just so ridiculous on its face. But let's not count on being culturally conservative to ultimately prevail against this kind of stuff. We have to have our churches be submitted to the Word of God, or we're not going to have any kind of foundation to fight against this stuff.
Is there a way that somebody can embrace both? Say I'm a Christian and I just hold gender ideology, or are these things in direct conflict, cosmologically speaking, on a worldview level? If so, it would seem the question would be, how do we then live with our neighbors who have a very different radical worldview than us, and these are not reconcilable? That's where the political question would come in. How much do we give and take? But let's start with the first one about, can you be a Christian and embrace gender theory, or are they just simply opposing views of the world?
I mean, I think you can be a Christian and believe a lot of stupid stuff. I like,
Okay.
like just that guy, like technically, right? Like I'm probably wrong on a lot of stuff, and God will
Okay.
have a lot of grace on me, right? So there's a thing about being an immature Christian and you don't understand yet, and I know people that they were converted, and the moment they were converted, they still had a lot of ridiculous ideas. But I do think the worldviews are inherently opposed, and a
Hmm.
Christian, as they're being sanctified, if they do still cling to some of this stuff, they'll start to question it, and ultimately, hopefully, God would purify them and rid them of those beliefs because they are based on atheistic, materialistic, and self-centered existentialist worldviews where everything revolves around you and your identity, and it doesn't revolve around emptying yourself of all your grievances and emptying yourself of any charge that you would have against God, and instead saying, I'm gonna submit myself to Christ, and I'm gonna lose my life to save it, not make everybody conform to me and bend the knee to me and what I think.
Kyle, I've probably read, I don't know, maybe half a dozen books on gender theory, queer theory, just to read primary sources. And a lot of the books that I've read start with individuals who just felt like they didn't fit certain cultural stereotypes. And the idea of certain postmodern language and critical theory was actually really liberating to them. So it's interesting to read that. It gives me some sympathy and empathy, even though I see the world very differently than many people do who embrace gender theory. What do you think is at the root of this for those who are promoting this, what we would call a new gender revolution? What's at the heart of it, do you think?
Well, I mentioned existentialism earlier, and I think this is, ultimately this isn't really about gender. It's this battle between uh, transcendentalism, or the idea that there are there are objective realities that are greater than ourselves. Um, and obviously the Christian worldview fits more into that, where God is eternal and his precepts are eternal, and we find ourselves living in his world, and we have to navigate, okay, how then do I submit myself to his will? Whereas the world and the message that's been pushed in Disney movies for the past 70 years, is that you follow your heart and you believe in yourself and you live your truth, and that is the goal and purpose of life. And gender theory is just, to me, it's just the outworking of that. Um, that, and it's just the logical conclusion of it, that even something so inherently biological and immutable as gender, as who you're born as, your body, even that must bow to your wishes and your desires. And then everybody around you has to affirm those things, because that's what we've subscribed to as a society, is that you follow your heart and believe in yourself, and nothing can go wrong, and I think this is the destructive outworking of that ideology.
So one of the last questions for you is, I'm curious, the highest commandment in the Bible is to love God and to love others. I want to know how you balance that with doing satire, in which would certainly be interpreted by some as hate, with the command to love.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to answer that. Obviously, you can look at the examples of the prophets or Christ, and who, you can't argue that Christ didn't love God and love others with every breath he took and every thought he thought. And yet there's times where he was pretty brutal. There's times where he called people broods of vipers, and and said, oh, you think Abraham's your father? Actually, your father's the devil. That's not. And if you look at some of the language from people that kind of hem and haw over satire, it's like, that wring their hands over that stuff. It's like, well, that's not very loving. Like, you're not loving others in that moment. So there must be a broader definition of loving others than just affirming people all the time. All that to say, I do shy away a little bit from making the argument like, well, the prophets did it. Jesus did it, so I can do it. The prophets also hacked people into pieces, and and I'm not arguing that would be appropriate for me to do. And I think we need to be really cautious about. I think we need to be really cautious about satire. C.S. Lewis famously said he didn't want to write Screwtape letters, any more Screwtape letters, because he started to think like a demon. And I think that's a strong warning for us, that we need to be really targeted with our satire and make sure it's not getting too mean, and make sure it's not consuming who we are, because you can get to a point where you're mocking so much that you don't believe in anything anymore. It's a real danger. C.S. Lewis, sorry, I keep quoting C.S. Lewis, is at the end of Abolition of Man, he talks about how the point of seeing through something is to see something through it, and you can't go on seeing through things forever, because then you see nothing. And I take that, like, satire deconstructs things and it breaks down ideas, but we want to break down false ideas to point people to something that's transcendent, to point people to what's true. And if you just start using that mocking satirical mind on everything, well, now what? Now you're mocking the Bible. Now you're mocking God. Now you're mocking the very idea of church, instead of just the silly church traditions that have built up. So you need to be targeted. You need to be careful. I think you really need to be grounded with satire, because it does need to have a moral basis that you're pointing to.
So if I'm not mistaken, your team has consistently pushed back on the right, like wokeness, on the left, wokeness, gender, socialism. Would you ever do like the Babylon Bee Guide to Christian Nationalism, or something that maybe hit home with your audience a little bit more? Or would that be like, I'm shooting folks potentially in the foot who might be in my audience? Or is it not big enough? Or is there some other crazy movement on the right that you think could be made fun of? Talk about the potential of something like that.
Yeah, I'd love to do. We sketched out what the Babylon Bee Guide to Christianity would look like, and I would love to write that. I think it would run the risk of, anytime you make jokes about church, you have a lot of upset people.
Really?
That think like, yeah, just no matter what it is, there's people that get upset about it because they think you're making fun of the eternal idea of the church and not
Oh, God.
the silly American way that we do church. You know what I mean? So I would love to do something like that. I do think, like I said, we need to mock whoever's being the most ridiculous, and that's why we do stuff like this. The other thing is that we do get to make those kinds of jokes in books like this as well.
Mm.
Um, our last book was the Babylon Bee Guide to Democracy, and what was fun about it is we have a page of jokes about Republicans and then a page of jokes about Democrats, and
Mm.
it didn't sell as well. So
Huh.
we have to own the libs, and that's the only way we can get people to buy our books, sadly.
Interesting. So that's fair enough. How do you resist that on one level? Is it just you just own that's the way discourse is today, and you choose who you make fun of, and you know your audience? Like, at what point do you just kind of go, well, we've got to weave in enough on the other side to kind of have some integrity and balance? I ask that because even on my channel, I have certain convictions, and it's easy to kind of go the lane. I know with certain interviews, I'm like, oh, if I own this side, I'll get a lot of views and people love it. But there's a pause for me sometimes that says, okay, am I being integrous with this? Is this fair? Am I being balanced? Now, of course, my lane is different than the Babylon Bee lane, so there's going to be some crossover and some differences. But how do you deal with kind of that challenge that comes up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. That's a little bit of what I was talking about, is trying to throw in the jabs the other way. Sometimes if you read a Babylon Bee article that's making fun of Democrats or Biden or something, the last line of the article will be like, "Meanwhile, Trump,
Mm.
blah blah blah," and so there's a little bit of Trump stepped on a rake. There you go. But that's a little bit of how we do it, is like, yeah, maybe the headline is a little punchier, and people are like, oh yeah, it's making fun of liberals. But then I want someone who clicks on that because they're a conservative to read through it and not feel super comfortable. Like, there should be a
Mm.
discomfort when you're reading
Mm.
comedy or you're consuming comedy. That's what makes the late night host so boring. A lot of times it's because it's like they agree with their audience, the audience agrees with them 100%, and they're never really going to go for the jugular of making fun of their own people. It's fun to go to a comedy show when you're like kind of agreeing with the person, and then all of a sudden they're like, and bam, and they tell a joke about you, and you're like, oh man, that's totally me. That's what's fun about comedy, is it can surprise you in that way. So I think we do need to do that. We do make jokes about the right often, and about Christians, obviously, probably more than any other group. So we try to do that as much as possible.
Do you have any guess, or I hate to use the word prophecy, but just hunch of where this whole gender discussion is going? Like, if we look 5 years from now or 10 years, do you have any guess, or is it such a wild, wild west that it's literally could go any direction?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I hesitate a little when I read, there's people on Twitter that'll go both ways. There's people that will say this is the end of Western civilization. There's no coming back from this. And then there's people that kind of, go the other way and say, huge pushback, and we're reclaiming culture. And I don't know. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle there.
Hmm.
There's probably going to be some polarization. You're gonna have a lot of people pushing back because of the blowback from this kind of stuff. But there's no denying that the tools that the left is using, like TikTok and public schools, are creating many, many disciples. So there is that danger too, that culture could sway past a tipping point. I like to think about. I'm doing one of my rereads of Lord of the Rings right now, and I love
Mm.
Tolkien's perspective on the passage of time, and the time that we're born in. Is like uh, outside of our control, and yet what's inside of our control is how we react to it. So
Amen.
it's like, be merry, be a joyful warrior, fight back, and ultimately the grand sweep of civilization is going to happen, whether no matter what I do. But I can tend my little farm. I don't actually have a farm, but you know what I mean. I can tend my Southern California suburban property, and raise my kids well, and be happy and be joyful and be a light to the world, regardless of where civilization's going. So it's almost the wrong question for the Christian when people are like, well, is America? Can we reclaim America? And I get where they're going. I'm not gonna like denigrate them for having that heart. I do think like ultimately Tolkien when he was writing, like the hobbits. Sorry, now I'm just talking about Lord of the Rings, but the hobbits are they're not interested in the grand sweep of politics. They fight because the Shire's under attack. And that's kind of a lot of where I think we need to be, is like being as local as possible and as committed to our churches as possible, and that's how we impact the world, I think.
That's fair. I like that call a lot. Some of my friends who are not believers and look at the church have said similar things to me as well. Did I miss anything? Anything else about the book or any ideas you want to get across to folks to understand? Or actually, let me ask you this. This will be the last question. Should I give a trigger warning for people reading this book? Because I know the spirit of it. I laughed at it. There's sometimes I cringed. I'm like, holy cow, I can't believe these guys said this. Sometimes I laughed out loud, went to my wife. Should people have a trigger warning when reading this book, or just dive in and you want to kind of shock people?
I'm always surprised when people say like, "Oh, I gave my kid a copy of the Babylon Bee Guide to Wokeness," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." They're gonna find some interesting stuff in there. So maybe have a talk with your teenagers before they read this book. But there's definitely some stuff in there that we attack in a very on the nose, straightforward way, where we just kind of tell it like it is, and that'll certainly surprise some folks.
Fair enough. Did I miss anything? I asked that question before. You want to get across, or did we cover it?
We just need everybody to buy 100 copies.
There you go. If everybody bought 100, the book would explode. Well, I enjoyed it. You guys make me laugh, make me think. I wish I could tell jokes the way that you guys do. I'm not gifted in that way, and I fully own that. But it's called Babylon Bee Guide to Gender. Check it out. And I would definitely agree, underneath it, you guys are telling jokes, but there's a worldview ideas that emerge through it that you can kind of see, oh, if I take this belief to its logical extension, here's what it might lead to. So despite what some people might think, and you get the reputation of just being somebody who's funny and not thoughtful, this book is definitely both. So check out the Babylon Bee Guide to Gender, and before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. I've got a lot of other interesting interviews coming up on a range of worldview and cultural topics. And if you thought about learning how to do apologetics, we would love to have you in our MA Apologetics program. It's fully distanced program now. Information is below. And if you're like, I'm not quite ready for a master's, we have a certificate program, and there's a significant discount below. We'd love to walk you through basic apologetics training and help you be more effective. Kyle, enjoyed it. When you guys come out with new books and new stuff that's going on, we'll keep having this conversation. Always appreciate you coming on the channel.
Awesome. Always appreciate it. Thank you.